I've seen a lot of rough cars in my days of digging up old drag cars and hot rods, but this has got to be one of the roughest that I've ever seen. But it's one of a kind. It's the only one like it in the world, and it started life as an Austin Healey, believe it or not, and has turned into this custom creation that was built in the 1960s, and I don't believe this thing ever sat indoors. This thing obviously has been outside for many decades. It's rotted to the ground. There's not a whole lot left here, but there's a whole lot to talk about. It's really hard to believe that somebody built this thing pretty much from scratch. Everything from the cowl forward is custom, and everything from the doors back is custom. Everything about this car has a custom touch to it, so we're going to get into the details of that. But I wanted to say that I had the opportunity to buy this car, and it's still on my mind. I haven't bought the car, and I haven't tracked down any history, but I'm working on it. So this started life as a 1961 Austin Healey 3000. Now these were already very sporty cars, very good looking cars, and they handled well. They had pretty decent horsepower for back in the day, and they're definitely a collectible car nowadays. There's not even a whole lot of parts on this thing worth using. So this is just strictly yard art or just a history piece, and for me it's sort of a history lesson. So let's get into the historical pieces that make this car so special. So first off is that front end. Austin Healey's had a pretty nice looking front end back in the day, so I'm not sure why somebody would have completely reinvented the wheel unless perhaps this car was wrecked back in the day. If this car was wrecked back in the day, then that would explain a lot of what's going on here. So that's kind of my theory going into this. So up front, you've got a custom grille with kind of a weird shape. You've got the little headlight buckets, and then right behind the front wheels, you've got these custom louvers, if you want to call them that, big vents that are just open. They don't actually go to anything. And then you've got a hood that is basically built from scratch. You can see the rough edges. They put trunk hinges up here on the hood. They're external hinges. And, you know, it's very crude, but somebody somewhere spent countless hours welding and hammering. And then obviously they went over the top of all this with filler at some point and probably had a paint job on this thing, even though it's hard to tell if it ever had paint on it or what color it may have been. Another very peculiar exterior detail is this windshield. So the frame is built out of round tubing, and there's no real flange for that glass to sit in there, but that is a Tri Five Chevrolet back glass that they've used as a windshield. So, you know, they had a pretty good concept here. The windshield's kind of laid back, and Austin Healey's already had a pretty sleek windshield combination back in the day, but they wanted this sort of wraparound windshield. Inside there's an aluminum piece on that dash. There's some factory looking gauges. Looks like the original steering wheel is still there, and there's some just random little pieces that look to be original, but I'm not really even sure what I'm looking at here. So the transmission tunnel appears to be somewhat original. It's just sitting in the car. I wasn't able to remove it to see what this transmission is, but that brings me to a very special and very peculiar detail about this car. So under the hood is a pretty unique engine. This is an aluminum V8 engine that was produced by General Motors in the early 1960s. 215 cubic inches, and these things made a range of horsepower ratings, but the top dogs had 11-to-1 compression and made about 200 horsepower, so that was pretty respectable. But the peculiar detail is how the engine is mated to the transmission. So if we take a look right here, you'll see a huge aluminum weld that connects what used to be a GM bell housing to whatever this transmission is. So both pieces are aluminum, and somebody just literally cut them and welded them together. And I'm not sure exactly how it all works. I see that this is a manual transmission. It has a hydraulic clutch. The clutch master cylinder and slave cylinder is still in place. I don't know if any of this ever actually worked, but it's all together, it's welded solid, and obviously somebody had this vision in their head of mating this one transmission to the other without any type of fancy adapter plate or aftermarket pieces. Like, they just did this at home. So moving further back, there's no drive shaft in the car, but you do see this rear end because of all the rust. You can see the rear end pretty easily. And at first thought, I thought that may be a Tri Five Chevy rear end, but then I saw the aluminum chunk. This is an Austin Healey rear end. So one of the only Austin Healey parts in this car is the rear end, but they ditched the rear suspension and made their own. So it's got friction shocks on the back with these little trailing arms that they built, and you can see that the frame actually goes the opposite side of the rear end, so it's sort of underslung compared to the way a normal rear end and rear frame section would be. So they had this thing sitting pretty low, and then this custom frame, I don't even know what this came out of, but those rear frame rails are pretty narrow. The main part of the frame is actually kind of wide. It goes out to the rocker panels and then dips in around the front suspension area, and that's where it gets interesting again. This front suspension is a torsion bar setup, and that, again, I'm scratching my head, like what would they have gotten this frame out of that would be a full frame car with Mopar style torsion bars? So Mopars from the 60s and 70s had torsion bars, but most of them were unibody cars. This thing has a big old chunky frame under it. So that got me to digging a little deeper, and I found that in the late 50s, like 57 and beyond, Chrysler used a full frame under their full-size cars, and they used torsion bar front suspension. And that's what this looks like. Another clue that this is a Chrysler product is during that same time, the Chryslers had wheel bolts and not wheel studs and lug nuts. My assumption and my speculation is this is 57 through about 60 Chrysler front suspension on this car. Another interesting detail is that the Austin Healey rear end would have typically had spline drive hubs for wire wheels, and this one does not. This one has 5 studs, just like a regular conventional American car, and it has these 14-inch steel wheels. So somebody had to do some work on those axles. I guess maybe they pulled the axles and drilled them and put studs in there so that they could put a conventional 5-lug steel wheel on this car. So back in the day, whoever built this thing was seriously modifying this car. They were not just bolting on some custom pieces or some aftermarket parts or anything like that. This was a true custom. And you'll see that even on the interior. You'll see that they carried those smooth body lines of those quarter panels, they carried it right into the interior. So normally that would just be kind of a rough edge. That's where your upholstery goes up to, but they rounded that over and made it a very smooth transition. So even though this thing is ridiculously rough and it's barely standing up on its own, it has my full attention. And even though I haven't bought it yet, I've gone down the path of researching this thing, hoping to find somebody who has some recollection of this car. And the guy who owns it now doesn't know much of anything about it, but he did tell me that somebody told him it used to race back at the Hickson drag strip, which closed in 1963, and that kind of lines up as far as the dates go. But I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure who might have built it. So I called a good friend, Larry Rose, and he is a drag racing and hot rod historian in the Chattanooga area. He knows about every hot rod that was built during the 50s and 60s. I mean, he was really plugged in. So I called him up. I said, hey, Austin Healey, tell me what you got. Who had Austin Healeys in the Chattanooga area back in the day? And he listed off 3 names, the 3 Austin Healeys that came to mind. And one of them belonged to a guy named Richard Houts, and it had a Cadillac V8 engine in it with 4 carburetors. So this thing was a pretty wild setup back then. Richard Houts had this car in the late 50s. Let's say that that car got wrecked and somebody completely cut the front end off and they had to do some suspension work, so they did this Chrysler torsion bar front suspension. While they were at it, they put an Oldsmobile 215 engine in it. While they were at it, they did these body modifications and rebuilt the front end because the old one was trash. I don't know, it's just a theory of mine, but that's the only thing I can come up with as far as the history on this car. But I'm gonna keep on digging. I'm gonna keep trying to find some information on who built this thing, when it was built, what the ideas were. Was it ever put on the road, or was this just one of those projects that never got finished? Who knows? So somewhere down the line, I hope to find somebody that knows something about this car and that can kind of fill in some of those gaps. So I was really thrilled to be able to go see this car. It's been on my mind ever since I saw it, and I kind of want to own this thing because it's a piece of local history. It's an old hot rod that was made out of a very peculiar foundation, an Austin Healey 3000 Roadster. It's a really wild combination of parts and pieces. It's a wild combination of ideas as far as the appearance of this car, the stance, the wheels and tires. All of those things required a tremendous amount of work to get to this point. So I know somebody poured their heart and soul into this car, and I want to find out the history of it. So if anybody out there knows anything about this car, I'd love to hear about it. I'm hoping to dig up more history, and if I find anything, you guys will be the first to know.